All right, we'll go ahead and get started today. So today we're going to be doing a webinar on the power of flows with Descope, and it's titled SAML Sans Struggle. So we're going to be covering SAML use cases with Descope flows. So the agenda, we're going to kind of cover some of the core SAML and SSO concepts. We're going to configure a SAML provider within a Descope tenant, and then we're going to look at some flow-based items for IdP-initiated, tenant-based auth flow, and then maintaining like self-signup. Then we're also going to look at our self-service tenant and SAML registration flow. So that's kind of what we're going to be looking at today. I'll go ahead and introduce myself. My name is Chris Carper, and I am a DevRel engineer at Descope, and I live in the DFW area. And I enjoy working on cars and traveling and driving. So this past week, I traveled to Austin to go see the Formula One race, which was really cool. So just kind of general car geek. So today we'll also kind of briefly cover like what Descope is, and we're a authentication and authorization provider, and we have flexible and secure user management, and we have like connectors within our ecosystem so you can connect to different tools like Segment, HubSpot, or reCAPTCHA, stuff like that, which is really awesome. Then we also kind of focus on no to low code workflows, but we also cover all of the different major SDKs for the various the various coding languages. So let's kind of look at the difference between SAML and SSO. So SAML is the security assertion markup language, whereas SSO is single sign-on. SAML is more of the protocol when you're interfacing between service providers and identity providers, whereas single sign-on is basically the authentication process that simplifies user access across multiple applications. So here's kind of a diagram about how SAML SSO works. So the user basically tries to access an application. The app generates the SAML request, which goes to the identity provider. The identity provider authenticates the user and then comes back with a SAML response to the application, so the service provider, and then the user is successfully logged in. So let's get to it. So today we're going to be looking at a few pieces of our documentation. So we're going to be looking at the setup of Okta integration applications. And then we're also going to be looking at the self-service guide here too. Both of these can be found underneath of our knowledge base articles. And then we're also going to look a little bit at customizing the auth methods for SSO with IdP-initiated, which is also covered in this guide, but just another place to kind of see where it is. So for our webinar today, I've already set up a Descope project. Just kind of briefly, I stepped through the getting started wizard. So if you haven't yet, you can sign up for Descope, step through the getting started wizard. Within the getting started wizard, I selected SSO and socials as our authentication methods. And that's kind of where we got to start. We're also going to be using the Descope React B2B sample app for this demo as well. We can send out the links to these guides as well as our React sample app if you want to clone it and follow along. So that's where we're going to get started. I'm going to be using Okta as our identity provider today, and I'm going to start with creating a tenant and configuring our application within Okta. So if we come down to tenants, I'm going to create a new tenant that's specific to Descope. So I'm going to name it Descope, and I'm going to set the tenant domain as descope.com. Create this guy. And then we're going to come over to SSO configuration. I'm going to go ahead and configure the tenant domain to be descope.com and save that. We'll go ahead and fill out these items first, then before saving. So within Okta, you can create an app. Actually, you can create the app by itself, or you can browse the catalog. because we do have one within the catalog. So we're going to go ahead and add the Descope SAML application. We'll go ahead and create it. We can give it a name. And then now if we step through our guide, we're going to basically create or configure the ACS URL and the entity ID, and then step through our attribute mapping within Okta. All of these like details specifically are in this guide, but we'll kind of work through this. So if we go to sign on and select edit, we'll leave the default relay state the same and configure our attributes here. And then we also have our ACS URL and entity ID. So here we can copy the ACS URL from Descope underneath of that tenant. And then we can also copy that entity ID, copy that over, and then that should look good. And if we look back over here, we'll set up our attribute mapping. So username, user.first name, and then email, user.email. And then for our groups, let me actually double check which groups we have. So here we can select the everyone group, or we can select the Chris test group. Let's look who's in the Chris test group. All right, let's actually remove that user. Okay, and then we're gonna use this group. So we're gonna map to group and equals this group. So now we've assigned that group. We have 2 users within that group. I'll go ahead and save this. So now we've configured the ACS URL and the entity ID within Okta. We've also added our attribute mapping. I'm going to go ahead and copy the metadata URL over here, which we'll be using. And then we'll go ahead and save this. It's not there. It's weird. We'll do it manually for this then. We'll go ahead and view SAML instructions. That's not the right one. Let's see. Packet general. Yeah, here we go. So now we can copy the single sign-on URL here. And then the entity ID. Let's actually download the certificate. So I'll open that within the browser. Our certificate. Here's our certificate. And then let's also look for the entity ID within SAML. Go ahead and open this in the browser. So here we've got the certificate and then the entity ID. We'll go ahead and refresh that page. Entity ID, then our login URL. Come back and grab. And then our certificate. All right, perfect. Then we'll also do dscope.com. All right, so now we've saved this. We entered the details manually, but again, you can use the metadata URL. I just had some caching issue that wasn't taking that URL. Then we can look at the SSO mapping. So here, since we are sending the username and the user's name as well as the email, we'll map these items here. So we'll say username, we'll map that to display name and then email to email. For this, we're not going to use the phone number, and then we'll also configure the group attribute for mapping the groups. Go ahead and save that. But then if we go here and say that the group test name is Chris test group, I'm going to go ahead and configure them to be the tenant admin. So we'll save this. And then if we go to our instance of our sample application, we can see currently we don't have any users configured in the space. However, we have the tenant with the tenant domain of descope.com, and we have the SSO configured and the mapping configured, which let's remove phone number. Okay, perfect. Then we can log in with one of our users and copy that user's info here. So now, just be sure I'll refresh the page here, and then we'll click continue with SSO. It's found that we have Okta configured for this tenant, and then we can sign in with Okta. And then we'll sign in. I did not add the users and groups. So I missed the step of going to assignments. So after you create the SAML application, you'll want to add people or groups. So I'll go ahead and assign groups, and I'm going to assign the Chris test group. Done. Make sure that's updated. And then we can go back over here. Let's go back to our sample application. And then once we log in, we'll be authenticated. Since I already had authenticated, I'll be authenticated here because I'd already stepped through the SAML authentication flow. But here I can update my name, submit, and now we're logged in as my user. So if we look back over here on the users page, we now have this user. We see that the user's login ID is here, and then of course has the ID from SAML as well, from the Okta provider. So that's a quick way to kind of step through the configuration of Okta and the tenant within Descope. We can take a look at our flow here as well that's automatically built out. So here we see our flow that we just used as SSO as the primary, or it can log in with one of the socials. And then it steps down for SSO authentication and then checks if the new users, if the user is a new user, and if the email is validated. And since it's coming from the IdP, it's going to be validated. So that's kind of where we get there. And then we end up updating the user's information. So the next thing we're going to look at is IdP-initiated. So when it comes to IdP-initiated, there's a couple configuration pieces you need to do. We'll start with within the flow. And here you can look at the IdP-initiated SSO. You basically add the IdP-initiated function, or I'm sorry, condition. And then we'll use the embedded link from Okta to log into our application. So here at the beginning of the flow, we'll add a condition. And we're going to say yes or no. And we're going to trigger on IdP-initiated. And if it's true, we're going to go down the yes path. If it's no, we'll go down the no path. So here we'll do that. We'll connect the start, move this into place. If it is yes, we bypass and go to SSO authentication. If it's no, we continue to the primary screen. So here, we'll also have to go back to the tenant and configure the redirect URL. So once the SSO authentication completes, it will redirect back to the flow. And then it's also going to know that it's IDP initiated, which then will authenticate our user. We're going to be using the redirect of our login screen. So we'll specifically say sign in here just for good measure. And we'll configure this redirect URL. And again, the redirect URL here has to be somewhere that hosts the flow where we're checking for the IDP initiated. So let's take a look here. So now, not IDP initiated. We don't see any authentication or anything here. It's just as if it was a few minutes ago. But let's go ahead and close this out. If we go back to general, we can copy the embedded link. So again, for IDP initiated, you do it via like an embedded link or like your Okta launcher or what have you. So I'm going to just be using the embedded link with an incognito browser. And then this is going to, of course, force me to authenticate because I'm not authenticated yet because I refreshed the browser. But if I copy my user details in, click sign in, I'll then be redirected back to the page that hosts our flow. And then we see that I'm logged in still. So we go back over and look at users. My user's here and is still the same user, which is pretty cool. But then if I copy this link again, since I'm already authenticated within this browser now, and say I go to google.com, but then I go here, since I'm already authenticated with Okta, it redirects me back to our authenticated space here. So pretty cool. So we've covered IDP initiated. Now let's take a look at tenant-based authentication and maintaining self-signup. So when it comes to SSO, if somebody comes to your login screen and they continue with a email address that's not associated with SSO, you're going to want to still handle that in some way because you don't want to just fail the user's authentication. So we have the ability to check if SSO is enabled and basically log the tenant or the user in based off of the tenant. So here we can go back to our flows, look at our sign up or in flow. And essentially, we're going to add some pieces here between SSO within the welcome screen and then the process of completing the SSO authentication. So we're going to add the action for SSO enabled. We're going to add this action here. This action is going to check that SSO is enabled on the tenant level. And then we're going to add a condition for SSO enabled. We're going to say yes or no. And we're going to say SSO enabled. And if it's true, so then we'll continue here. And I'll clean this up in a minute as well. If SSO is enabled, we're going to continue with SSO. Otherwise, we will give another auth method. So for here, I'm just going to use sign up or in with OTP. So we'll connect the sign up or in with an OTP here. And then I'm also going to bring the choose another auth method back to the welcome screen. And then once verified, for now, we can come down here to is a new user. And then if we prettify this a little bit, we can look at this and see that we have IDP initiated. If no, we come here and then We check if SSO is enabled. If it is, then it continues with SSO authentication. If not, we sign up via another method. So let's go ahead and save this and give this a try. So then I'm going to start with a new incognito browser. And let's then see this work in two different ways. So the first way I'm going to do it is I'm going to log in with SSO. It's going to prompt me to log in. And then we'll sign in here. And now we're logged in. Again, same user as usual. So now if I use a different user that is not SSO enabled, I'll be prompted for OTP. So I'll come and get my OTP code. Copy this in. Go ahead and click submit. And now I'm logged in with this new user. We can refresh this page and we'll see that this user is now created. So this allows you to maintain your self-registration in the event a user doesn't have SSO enabled. But now I'm going to take this one step further and I'm going to go ahead and delete this user. And now we're going to cover the use case of if SSO is not enabled and the tenant doesn't exist for that user based on the domain, create a tenant for that user. So here, this is going to come after the SSO piece. Let's see here. So we check that SSO is enabled. If no, we're still going to go down the same path to prompt with another auth method. But instead of going straight to the is a new user, we're going to add some pieces here. So here, we're going to add a condition. And we're going to say tenant exists, yes or no. And we're going to say tenants, so user.tenant. And let's say is not empty means that a tenant exists for that user. And so then we'll click done. We'll connect this here. So say I log in with a user that doesn't exist and there's no tenant associated with that domain, then it's going to basically come here. It's going to say that there are no tenants associated since this is empty, and then we'll create a tenant. So action create tenant. So this, yes, we're going to go ahead and still bring down to is new user. If no, we're going to create a tenant. This will basically allow you to create the tenant for that domain of that user. But I want to take it one step further as well, because we're going to cover the SSO provisioning by yourself. So we're going to go ahead and add here the ability to add roles to the user as well. So if it's like the first user created within the tenant, we can say, okay, let's go ahead and give them tenant admin. You can always change that logic later to say add all users as tenant admin or what have you. But for this example, we're going to go ahead and add it just for the first user within the tenant. So we're going to do update user roles. So we'll click here. And then we'll also edit this because I want to add that user as a tenant admin so I can later configure SSO. And then we'll go ahead and connect this back down as well. So let's kind of certify that and take a look at our path. So again, we're checking if SSO is enabled. And then if it is, we'll continue down the path of logging in via SSO. If it's not, we're going to continue down the path of validating the user and then create or checking if the tenant exists. And then if not, creating it and then moving on to adding the tenant admin role. So we'll go ahead and save this. Again, I still only have Descope users here. So if we come back over and sign out, which will take us back to our login page, and no users here. And then if I log in with the same user, it's going to prompt me for OTP again. And then we'll click submit, we'll log in, and then we're authenticated. So here, if we look at our columns, let's go ahead and look at status and tenants and roles. So now we have a new tenant that's been created for this user, and this user is now a tenant admin. So then if we look back at our tenants, we see that we have this tenant here, and we're going to configure this domain during the self-provisioning flow. So then we'll look here, since we're a tenant admin within our sample application. Let's go back here. And all right, so we're authenticated as this user, which has the tenant admin associated. If we go to SSO setup, let's see, I might be working with a weird version. Carper tools, console. Log this out again. Yeah. All right. Here it is. It's interesting. Let's take a look at our user's job then. Oh, that's why. Okay. I'm using incognito, so it doesn't want to use third-party cookies. So let's change this. Third-party cookies are allowed. This should be working. Let's go ahead and just do it within a non-incognito. So I'll authenticate here. Let's check the cookies on the user. All right, so now, yeah, so now we've got the user cookie here. So probably something with my incognito configuration. But now we can go to the SSO setup page. It should populate for us. That's interesting. I'm going to go ahead and re-clone this. Give me 1 second. All right. So we'll then set the project value. Let's double check if that's right. Okay, and then React. Go ahead and export the app ID as well. All right, and then we'll start this. So I was working on an older version of the repo. So let's check this here. And you update the dependencies. As we're going as well, if anybody has any questions, feel free to drop it in the Q&A section. We'll get those all answered as we go. Just installing all the dependencies again, so just give me 1 minute. All right, perfect. Start this up. Ready? Looks like it's still starting. All right, here we go. And then make sure it's on the right one. Let's be sure. I have to force this guy. All right, perfect. A little refresh here, make sure everything looks right. All right, now let's log in with our user. Perfect. We have the DSR and the DS here. And we'll continue. This might be something with our sample app. Let's go ahead and let's try this a different route. So let's go to explorer.descope.com. And then we're going to copy in our project ID. And we're going to start with the sign up or end flow, which is the same flow we've been using within the sample application, but we're going to do this a little bit differently. And then we're also going to say that we want to post authentication flow for the SAML config. SAML config, update that. And let's log in with our user. Continue with SSO. Authenticate the user. Submit. That's weird. So this was working. Let's take a look at our user. Well, this also has our jot, which has the tenant ID and tenant name. But the tenant level, that's right. Okay. It's an issue within our flow, I think. So let's go ahead and go back over here. Let's delete our user. And then also delete our tenant. So we're going to delete this guy, tenants, delete the name. So let's go back to our flow. And let's look at the update roles section. So here, instead of at a project level, it needs to be on a tenant level. So that was my error there. So then if we rerun this flow, Let's note that the user no longer exists and neither does the tenant. So that user doesn't exist, that tenant's then wiped out. But if we step through this flow now, continue with SSO. Submit. Roles. Why did it fail now? Let's see. The tenant is created. Let's double check. This should be working. So we check the tenant exists. If the tenant doesn't exist, we create the tenant and then we update the user's roles. Let's then let's try with another project really quickly. Could be something that I have on that project. So I've got this other project as well, which has the same flow basically. We can go ahead and delete this user again. And then also the tenant. So no user, no tenant related. And within the flow, it's very similar, if not the exact same. We check if it's IDP initiated, SSO enabled. If it is, we continue with authenticating via SSO. If not, we validate the user. And then if the tenant doesn't exist, we create the tenant and then again, add the role to the user and then continue down the path. So let's go ahead and take a look at this. We'll copy the project ID and let's go ahead and change our configuration. The flow ID and the SAML config remain the same. Now we can step through this with the same user. Continue with SSO. Get our OTP code and submit. And we'll continue down that path. So see here, we then now have the tenant admin role on the tenant. So previously that was the issue, was the tenant admin wasn't associated here. It was associated here. We then see our SAML configuration populate here. But let's go back to the sample application now, but we're going to go ahead and swap out the project ID to be this project ID. So come down, project ID, update this there, and then we'll also update here. Go ahead and restart the application. And while that's restarting, I'm going to remove that user again. So we can bring this over to that side if we want to, but delete the tenant. And then we'll also delete the user. So then the tenant and the user are no longer there. We'll log in with the same user. Then continue with SSO. It's going to validate our OTP. Continue checking the rest of the flow. So then we step through the flow, and here we can see that the user exists. And now when we click on SSO setup, this now populates correctly. So essentially earlier, our tenant role was not being set on the tenant level, but at the project level. So that was the issue there. So now we'll step through and configure the domain for this. So this is basically everything we did in the initial like 5-10 minutes where we configured everything at the tenant level. So if we look back at my other Descope application, within this webinar piece, we see that this tenant is here. And essentially all of the items on the SSO configuration page, we're going to be able to do through the application using the embedded self-service provisioning. So that's basically what this is. So I'm going to go ahead and bring this to this screen, and we're going to create a new application within SAML. And we're going to add our company domain here, click next, and then we'll click Okta since we're using Okta, but of course you can use any of these other providers or generic SAML 2.0. And what's cool here is that we now get a step-by-step, like this is how you do it. This, of course, is if you're going to create the application by itself. However, you can add the app from the catalog. So I'm going to go ahead and browse the app catalog and then search for Descope. The integration here, and then Descope. Name it. Click done. And then here, we'll go back and set up the SAML configuration. So we'll edit this. And here, basically, it automatically gathers the information from the tenant, which makes it really nice for the user. So this is really nice if you have like a business-to-business use case and you have multiple users and multiple tenants configuring their own SSO. That way it takes the load off of you as the app owner to not have to manually enter this. So it's cool because it goes in and gets the project tenant items and allows you to just copy it directly. So if we click here on the ACS URL, and then we also have the entity ID, and then we'll scroll through here, and it tells us how to configure the attribute mapping as well. So we're going to say first name, and then user.first name. And then see what we got here. We can also add more. So we'll say email, user.email. So then this part isn't applicable because it's configured as a application that we use instead of just manually creating it. So then we can click save here. And then we'll come up to assignments. I only want to assign one person, which is going to be this user, which matches the domain name. We're going to save. That user's then assigned. There we go. And then we're going to come back to the sign-on tab. And we're going to get more details. And then I'm going to download this certificate. And then we'll configure these pieces here. So here's this guy for the single sign-on. And then this is going to be the issuer. But to verify, we can check the metadata URL as well, which we see the issuer here is the entity ID, these match, and then I'll open up a certificate. Copy it as well. So then we can click next. We see that it's completed successfully. Click done. It'll take us back here. Then if we look within this, this tenant, we've got our SSO configuration here as well. And then once we log into our application now with that user, it should log us in via SSO. So let's go to localhost 3001. We're already logged in. So let's go ahead and log out. And log in with continue with SSO. We'll do SAML redirect URL. Let's double check then. We've got our login URL, our entity ID, and our certificate. And then this redirect URLs auto-populated, which is weird. So we'll want to double check this as well. So this wouldn't necessarily apply if we weren't using the IDP initiated in general. Let's refresh this page. All right, save. Do this. Go ahead and copy this here. And save. All right, cool. So now we have the redirect correctly configured. Refresh here. Continue with SSO. Weird because yes, that should be assigned. Let's double check that the user got assigned there correctly. Assignments. We've got the user. It's assigned. And then we can check the sign on, make sure everything matches. So this is T2. And this is in R3, so that's right. And then the ACS URL should still be right because it's got the R3. C7. Okay. Let's also ensure that a group is assigned this, which should be everyone, which will include that user. Let's give it another shot. Weird. So we've got the user here. It's a tenant admin of that tenant. That tenant's created. Let's double check this. Where's the admin assigned? This is the correct app. Assignments, everyone. Correct assignments. This is correct. Assignments, visual. Let's double check this user. So it's assigned to this application. The groups it's in are both of these. Let's go ahead and also double check if the group is passed. If we go back to our applications, we'll edit the items here. Let's go ahead and change this back to display name and name group equals. Go ahead and save that. Let's double check that the SSO mapping is right. Let's actually change. system name, phone is fine. And then the group mapping shouldn't matter. Let's go ahead and click save. We've got our assignments. Let's add the other group as well. So assign groups. It's this group, which has these two users. So assign to groups. Assign, done. All right, now we have both of them. Let's try this. Which is strange. Try a different browser. All right, let's see. The password's the same as this one. Nope. Let's go ahead and update that user's password. Reset password. Temporary password. So copy this temporary password. Sign in. It's going to prompt us for an updated password. Change the password. It's weird that it's still not assigned because the user should be assigned to the application, which is strange. So this should work. Let's briefly go ahead and switch something here. So if I log in via the other user, let's go ahead and do, let's go ahead and delete the user really quick. So, and the tenant. So if we delete the tenant, because it could just be something with how Okta is interacting with that user. And then delete the user. And then let's say both of these are gone. So then let's log in with the Descope account. So now that user doesn't exist and the tenant doesn't exist for it. And we can log in. Submit our user. And then let's go ahead and step through this one more time. We're going to look at Okta. And we can go ahead and use the same application, but we'll just update the configuration on the application. So I'll go to sign on. We're going to edit these pieces. We'll scroll down. The ACS URL, which is here. Clear out that entity ID, add this entity ID, and then I still have the certificate open, so I'll copy that in. And then under more details, there's the issuer. Here's our single sign-on URL. Then let's click next. Done. Then let's ensure that user is assigned to it after we save. So then we do have this person assigned to it, but then let's also just double check that we have our other groups. So assign groups. We're going to go ahead and use this group as well. Click done. And then let's sign out here. And then let's log in with our Descope user. So we've got that. And now we're logged in with our Descope user. But just to be sure, let's go ahead and use an incognito browser. Well, just another browser in general. Let's go ahead and use Firefox. All right, we're going to log in with this user. Fill this out. And then if we look under here, we see that we've got a new tenant with the configurations that we made. This will need to be updated for the IDP initiated, of course. But then if we look at our users, we then have this user, which is a SAML user. And we can see that here. We also have the Chris at Descope.com, which is also a SAML user. Note that based off of best practices, we don't merge SAML users with non-SAML users. But if you have any questions on that, feel free to ask us as well. But yeah, so that's kind of what we wanted to cover today. So today we covered some like core SAML concepts. We worked with configuring a tenant manually within Descope to interact with Okta as an IDP. Then we configured IdP-initiated authentication and configured our flow to handle that. And then we also set up tenant-based authentication where we created a tenant for the user if one didn't exist, which allows us to maintain self-signup. And then we also step through the self-service SAML registration and provisioning. So that's what I have to cover today. But if anyone has any questions to ask live, I know we're down to the last minute or so. But if anybody has any questions to ask, feel free to drop those in the Q&A section. Give it another minute or so for any questions to pop up. So can you use multiple different SAML IDPs depending on the user? Can you associate specific email domains where you configure the SAML providers? So for the first part of this question, can you use multiple different SAML IDPs depending on the user? Yes. So that's kind of what we were looking at within the flow where it checks if SSO is enabled. Once it checks SSO enabled, if it is, it's going to only trigger the SSO authentication for the user based off of the user's email domain. So that's kind of that initial part of that question. And then can you associate specific email domains where you configure the SAML providers? Yes. So when configuring the SAML provider within the SSO configuration, you basically configure the email domain here. So that's good. And then could you share the app and the flow part for download? Yeah, so we can send out the link to the sample application as well as a download link as well to the flow that we built out here. Or potentially we could even publish it on our Descope Explorer, but I'll go ahead and get a download link for this as well. Well, cool. If no more questions, thank you guys for joining and learning more about SAML's interaction with Descope. Have a good day.